Uh, my name is Martha, and I'm 28 years old. 3 months ago, I thought I had everything figured out. I was about to meet my fiancé's wealthy parents for the first time, driving through their exclusive neighborhood in a borrowed dress that cost me 2 credit card payments. I was already 30 minutes late, my hands shaking on the steering wheel, desperate to make the perfect first impression. But sometimes, life has a way of showing you who people really are when you least expect it. What I discovered that evening about the family I almost married into was so unthinkable, it changed everything I believed about love, loyalty, and the price some people will pay to protect their perfect image. Before we dive into this story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments below. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew. Trust me, you won't believe what happened when I stepped inside that mansion. My heart was pounding as I navigated the winding roads of Millbrook Heights, one of those neighborhoods where every house looked like it belonged in a magazine and every lawn was perfectly manicured. I'd been dating Richard for 18 months, and tonight was the night I'd finally meet Harold and Eleanor, his parents. Richard had been putting this meeting off for so long that I'd started to wonder if he was embarrassed by me. I was a high school English teacher, solidly middle class, driving a 5-year-old Honda Civic that looked painfully out of place among the BMWs and Mercedes in this area. For tonight, I'd splurged on a navy blue dress from Nordstrom that had cost me $300 money I definitely didn't have to spare. I'd practiced conversation topics in the mirror, researched wine pairings, and even watched YouTube videos on proper dining etiquette. My GPS had malfunctioned 20 minutes earlier, leaving me lost in a maze of tree-lined streets with names like Covington Lane and Pemberton Circle. Every mansion I passed seemed more intimidating than the last, with iron gates and circular driveways that screamed old money. I was already 30 minutes late, and my anxiety was through the roof. That's when I saw her. An elderly woman, probably in her 70s, was backed against a brick mailbox, while a young man in his 20s towered over her, his voice raised and aggressive. Even from my car, I could see she was trembling, clutching her purse tightly to her chest, while he gestured wildly, clearly demanding something from her. "Come on, old lady, just hand it over, and nobody gets hurt." His voice carried across the quiet street, harsh and threatening. I should have kept driving. I was already late for the most important dinner of my relationship, but watching this helpless woman being terrorized by someone half her age made my blood boil. I'd been raised to stand up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves. I pulled over and grabbed my phone quickly, starting a video recording as I approached them. "Hey, leave her alone." The young man, who I'd later learn was named Tommy, spun around to face me. He was thin but wiry, with greasy brown hair, and clothes that looked like he'd been sleeping in them. "Mind your own business, lady. This doesn't concern you." "It concerns me when I see someone being harassed," I said firmly, holding up my phone. "I'm recording this, and I've already called 911. It was a lie, but a convincing one. Agnes, the elderly woman, looked at me with such relief and gratitude that it broke my heart. She was tiny, maybe 5 feet tall, with silver hair pinned back neatly, and wearing a cardigan that had seen better days. Despite her fear, there was a dignity about her that reminded me of my own grandmother. "You crazy witch!" Tommy snarled, but I could see uncertainty creeping into his eyes as he noticed other neighbors starting to peer out their windows. "This ain't over." He shoved past me roughly, nearly knocking me down before jogging away down the street. Agnes was shaking so badly she could barely stand. I immediately went to her side, steadying her with a gentle hand on her arm. "Are you hurt? Do you need me to call an ambulance?" I asked, genuinely concerned. No, dear. I'm quite all right, thanks to you." Her voice was soft but clear, with just a hint of an accent I couldn't place. "You have such a kind heart. I hope they deserve you. The comment struck me as odd, but I attributed it to the shock of what had just happened. Agnes accepted my offer of a ride, giving me an address that turned out to be surprisingly close to where Richard's family lived. As we drove through the quiet streets, she seemed to relax, though I noticed her studying me carefully in the passenger seat. You know, dear, I've been watching people in this neighborhood for nearly 40 years, she said thoughtfully, adjusting her seatbelt. You learn a lot about human nature when you pay attention to how folks treat each other when they think nobody's looking. I glanced over at her, intrigued. What do you mean? Agnes was quiet for a moment, looking out at the grand houses we were passing. Money changes people, child. Not always for the better. These big houses, they're good at hiding family secrets. Something in her tone made me uncomfortable, though I couldn't put my finger on why. I suppose every family has their issues, I said diplomatically. Oh, some more than others. Agnes turned to look at me directly. You mentioned you're meeting someone's parents tonight. Which family, if you don't mind me asking? The Worthingtons, I replied. My fiancé Richard's parents, Harold and Eleanor. Do you know them? Agnes went very still, and I saw her hands tighten slightly in her lap. Harold and Eleanor Worthington, she repeated slowly. Yes, I know of them. Tell me, dear, how long have you been with their son? 18 months. I answered, though I was beginning to feel like I was being interviewed. We're engaged. Well, not officially yet, but he's hinted. I trailed off suddenly, feeling foolish for sharing so much with a stranger. And this is your first time meeting his parents? Yes, Richard said they've been traveling a lot, but honestly, I was starting to think he didn't want them to meet me. I tried to keep my voice light, but Agnes seemed to see right through me. Wealthy families can be very particular about who they welcome into their circle, Agnes said carefully. They often have different faces for different people. The face they show at charity galas isn't always the same one they wear behind closed doors. I felt a chill run down my spine, though I told myself she was probably just being dramatic. Richard's parents seem lovely from what he's told me. They're very involved in the community, donate to lots of charities. Agnes made a non-committal sound. I worked in service for many wealthy families over the years, dear. Saw plenty of things that would surprise you. Sometimes the people with the most beautiful houses have the ugliest secrets. We were approaching her destination now, and I could see she lived in a small cottage behind one of the larger estates. It was modest, but well-maintained, with a tiny garden that looked lovingly tended. I used to work for the family that owns the big house, Agnes explained, noticing my curiosity. They let me stay in the cottage when I retired. Been here 15 years now. As she prepared to get out of the car, Agnes turned to me one final time. Martha, isn't it? I nodded, surprised she'd remembered my name from our brief introduction. Remember this, dear. Sometimes the people who rescue others are the ones who need rescuing themselves. And trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. She squeezed my hand gently. You're a good person. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. With that cryptic warning, she was gone, walking slowly toward her cottage. I sat in my car for a moment, unsettled by our conversation, but unable to pinpoint exactly why. Agnes seemed like a sweet old woman, but there had been something almost prophetic about her warnings. I shook off the feeling and checked my GPS. Richard's family estate was less than 5 minutes away. I was now 45 minutes late, and my stomach was in knots. Whatever Agnes had meant by her warnings, I was about to find out if there was any truth to them. The Worthington estate was even more imposing than I'd imagined. A massive colonial mansion sat at the end of a circular driveway, complete with white columns and perfectly symmetrical landscaping. Every detail screamed wealth and status, from the pristine brick facade to the ornate ironwork around the windows. I felt like I was approaching a museum rather than someone's home. Richard was waiting for me on the front steps, and I could see the tension in his shoulders even from a distance. He was 31, tall and lean, with dark hair that he kept perfectly styled, wearing a navy blazer that probably cost more than my monthly salary. Usually he greeted me with a warm smile and a hug, but tonight he seemed almost businesslike. "Martha, thank God you're here," he said, checking his watch pointedly. "My parents are very particular about punctuality. Where have you been?" I started to tell him about helping Agnes, but something in his expression stopped me. This wasn't the Richard I knew, the one who would have been proud of me for helping someone in need. This version seemed more concerned about his parents' approval than my well-being. "Sorry the GPS got confused in all these winding streets," I said instead, following him toward the massive front door. "Just remember what we talked about," Richard said under his breath as we approached the entrance. "They can seem a bit formal at first, but they mean well. And please don't mention your student loans or your father's business troubles. They don't really understand financial struggles." Before I could respond, the door opened to reveal a distinguished man in his early 60s. Harold Worthington was exactly what I'd expected, silver-haired, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, even for a casual dinner at home, with pale blue eyes that seemed to catalog and assess everything they saw. "Father, this is Martha," Richard said, his voice taking on a tone I'd never heard before, almost deferential. Harold's handshake was firm but cold, and his smile never reached his eyes. "Martha, Richard has told us so much about you." The way he said it didn't sound like a compliment. His gaze swept over my dress, my shoes, my simple jewelry, and I felt like I was being appraised and found wanting. Eleanor appeared next, a petite woman with perfectly styled blonde hair and the kind of ageless beauty that spoke of expensive treatments and regular spa visits. She was wearing what I was sure was a designer dress that cost more than my car payment, and her jewelry was understated but obviously real. "Oh, my dear, what a lovely little dress," Eleanor said, air-kissing both my cheeks. "So refreshing to see someone who shops at department stores. I always tell my friends that not everyone can afford custom pieces." The comment hit like a slap, dressed up as a compliment, but clearly intended to put me in my place. Richard either didn't notice or chose to ignore it. Dinner was served in a formal dining room that could have seated 20 people comfortably. The table was set with what looked like genuine antique china and enough silverware to confuse an etiquette expert. I found myself grateful for those YouTube videos I'd watched. The conversation quickly turned into what felt like an interrogation. Harold asked pointed questions about my family's background, my career prospects, and my long-term financial goals. When I mentioned that my father owned a small accounting firm, his eyebrows raised slightly. "Small business can be so challenging," he said smoothly. "All those regulations and tax complications, one small mistake, and the IRS can shut you down permanently." Eleanor chimed in with stories about families they knew, always emphasizing the importance of appropriate matches and maintaining family standards. She had a particular talent for making cutting remarks sound like friendly observations. "We've always taught Richard to be very careful about serious relationships," she said, dabbing at her lips with a linen napkin. "Young people today can be so impulsive about love, but marriage is really about compatibility on so many levels: financial, social, intellectual." Throughout the meal, I noticed that Richard barely spoke unless directly addressed by his parents. The confident, funny man I'd fallen in love with seemed to have disappeared, replaced by someone who hung on his parents' every word and never challenged their increasingly uncomfortable comments. I also couldn't help but notice the behavior of the household staff. Rose, the maid who served our dinner, moved around the table like she was walking on eggshells, never making eye contact, and flinching slightly whenever Harold spoke to her. The atmosphere in the house felt oppressive, like everyone except Harold and Eleanor was afraid of something. "Tell me, Martha," Harold said as we finished the main course. "What are your thoughts on prenuptial agreements?" In families like ours, they're absolutely essential for protecting generational wealth. The question caught me off guard. Richard and I had never discussed marriage in such concrete terms, let alone prenups. I suppose they make sense for people with significant assets to protect, I said carefully. Eleanor laughed a sound like tinkling glass. Oh, how diplomatic! But surely you understand that when families have worked for generations to build something meaningful, they have to be very careful about who they allow into their circle. As the evening wore on, I began to realize that this wasn't just typical wealthy family snobbery. There was something calculating about the way Harold and Eleanor spoke, as if every word was carefully chosen to achieve a specific effect. They weren't just evaluating whether I was good enough for their son. They were actively working to make me feel unwelcome. When Eleanor casually mentioned how Richard's previous girlfriend had suddenly realized that she wasn't ready for a serious commitment, I felt the first real flicker of alarm. The way she said it, with a satisfied little smile, made me wonder exactly what had caused this sudden realization. When I excused myself to use the restroom, I got lost in the mansion's maze of corridors. The house was enormous with multiple wings and what seemed like dozens of rooms. As I wandered, trying to find my way back to the dining room, I heard voices coming from behind a partially open door. I recognized Harold's voice immediately, followed by Eleanor's lighter tone. They were talking quietly, but something about their conversation made me freeze in place. She's exactly what we expected, Eleanor was saying. Pretty enough, but clearly not sophisticated. That dress probably came from Macy's. The background check confirmed everything, Harold replied. Middle-class family student debt father's business has some tax irregularities that could be problematic. She's a liability. My blood turned to ice. Background check. Tax irregularities. What were they talking about? The usual methods should work, Eleanor continued. We have enough information about her family to apply the right kind of pressure. Her father's accounting firm, for instance. A few calls to the right people at the IRS, and suddenly his business becomes very difficult to maintain. I pressed myself against the wall, hardly daring to breathe. They were discussing my family like we were problems to be solved. Remember how quickly that Diane girl reconsidered her relationship with Richard once we explained the situation with her brother's immigration status? Harold's voice carried a note of satisfaction. Young love dies quickly when real consequences are involved. This one might be more stubborn, Eleanor warned. She has that self-righteous streak. Did you see how she defended that little maid when Rose dropped the serving spoon? Very telling. Then we'll have to be more direct. I've already had my people compile a comprehensive file on her family. The father's business, her mother's medical bills, even her student loan servicer. Amazing how quickly financial institutions can change their terms when the right pressure is applied. I felt like I was going to be sick. They were talking about destroying my family's livelihood, my parents' security, just to get me out of their son's life. And from the casual way they discussed it, this wasn't their first time using such tactics. How long do we give her? Eleanor asked. 72 hours should be sufficient, Harold replied. By then, she'll understand that staying with Richard would be very expensive for everyone she cares about. I heard footsteps approaching and quickly ducked into the nearest room, which turned out to be a small library. My heart was pounding so hard, I was sure they'd hear it from the hallway. When the footsteps passed, I waited several more minutes before carefully making my way back to the dining room. Richard looked up as I returned his expression, showing mild concern. Everything all right? You were gone for quite a while. Just got a bit turned around, I managed, forcing a smile. Beautiful house. Eleanor beamed at me. Why, thank you, dear. Harold and I have put so much love into making this a proper family home. The word love coming from her mouth made my stomach turn. I spent the rest of the evening in a state of barely controlled panic, smiling and nodding at appropriate moments while my mind raced. Every comment from Harold and Eleanor now sounded sinister. Every smile seemed calculating. When Harold casually mentioned knowing something about small business tax law and offered to look into my father's situation, I nearly choked on my wine. When Eleanor suggested that I might want to think carefully about my future goals, her voice carried an undertone of threat that I was sure only I could hear. Richard, meanwhile, seemed oblivious to the undercurrents. He laughed at his father's jokes and agreed enthusiastically with his mother's observations about the importance of compatible backgrounds in relationships. The next morning, I couldn't shake what I'd overheard. Every instinct I had was screaming that something was terribly wrong, but when I tried to talk to Richard about his parents' behavior, he dismissed my concerns completely. "They're just protective," he said over coffee at his apartment. "They've seen me get hurt before, and they want to make sure you're serious about us." "Richard, your mother basically told me I wasn't sophisticated enough for your family, and your father made some pretty pointed comments about my background." "You're being paranoid, Martha. They liked you. My mother said you were charming in your own way." The phrase made my skin crawl, but Richard said it like it was a compliment. I realized with growing horror that he either genuinely didn't see what his parents were doing, or he'd been conditioned to accept it as normal. That afternoon, I received a phone call that confirmed my worst fears. It was my father sounding confused and worried. "Martha, honey, I got the strangest call today from someone claiming to be from the IRS. They said there were irregularities in my business filings and that I should expect an audit soon. But I've been working with the same accountant for 15 years, and we've never had any problems." My hands started shaking. "What exactly did they say, Dad?" "Something about discrepancies in my expense reporting and potential penalties. The man was very official sounding new details about my business that he shouldn't have known. Martha, an audit could put me under. You know how tight things have been since your mother's medical bills." I closed my eyes, feeling sick. It had been less than 24 hours since I'd overheard Harold and Eleanor's conversation, and they were already putting their plan into motion. "Dad, don't worry about it right now. Let me make some calls and see what I can find out." But I knew exactly what was happening. Harold had used his connections to target my family, just like Eleanor had hinted they'd done to Richard's previous girlfriend. The irregularities in my father's taxes were probably manufactured, but proving that would cost more than my family could afford. I spent the rest of the day researching the Worthington family online, looking for any information about Richard's past relationships. It took some digging, but I eventually found social media profiles and newspaper mentions that painted a disturbing picture. Richard had been engaged once before to a woman named Diane Chen. According to old society page photos, they'd seemed happy together for over 2 years. Then suddenly, all mentions of her disappeared from his social media, and within 6 months, she'd moved across the country. I found her current social media profiles and noticed something interesting. About the time her relationship with Richard ended, she'd started posting frequently about her younger brother's immigration struggles and her family's legal bills. The pieces were falling into place, and the picture they formed was horrifying. Harold and Eleanor weren't just snobby rich parents. They were manipulative predators who systematically destroyed anyone they deemed unworthy of their son. I knew I couldn't handle this alone, so I reached out to the one person who might understand what I was dealing with. It took some searching, but I managed to track down Diane Chen's current contact information through a professional networking site. When I called her, she was initially hesitant to talk, but when I mentioned the Worthington family, her attitude changed completely. "Oh, God," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're dating Richard, aren't you?" "I'm engaged to him, or I was until I found out what his parents are really like." "They went after your family, too." Diane's voice was filled with a mixture of sympathy and rage. "What did they threaten?" I told her about the phone call to my father, and she listened with the understanding of someone who'd been through the same nightmare. "They destroyed my brother's immigration case," she said quietly. Alex had been waiting for his green card for 3 years, had a job lined up, was planning to get married. Then suddenly his application was flagged for additional review, and his work authorization was revoked. We found out later that someone with connections had made calls, raised questions about his character. How did you find out it was them? I didn't not until much later. At the time, Harold presented himself as the solution. He offered to use his connections to help. Alex said he knew immigration lawyers who could fix the problem. All I had to do was end my relationship with Richard and move away quietly. I felt sick listening to her story, knowing that my family was being put through the same calculated torture. Did you ever tell Richard what his parents did? Diane was quiet for a long moment. I tried, but he's so completely under their influence that he couldn't see it. He accused me of lying, said I was trying to turn him against his family. That's when I realized that even if I could prove what they'd done, Richard would never choose me over them. So you just left? What choice did I have? My brother's entire future was at stake. Our family had already spent $20,000 on legal fees trying to fix the mess Harold had created. I couldn't watch them destroy Alex's life just because I'd fallen in love with the wrong person. After talking to Diane, I knew I had to find more evidence. If I was going to confront the Worthingtons, I needed proof that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. That's when I remembered Agnes and her cryptic warnings about wealthy families and their secrets. Something told me that a woman who'd worked in service for 40 years might know more about the Worthington family than she'd initially let on. I drove back to the neighborhood and found Agnes working in her small garden behind the cottage. When she saw me approaching, she straightened up with a knowing look. "I was wondering when you'd come back, dear," she said simply. "Agnes, I need to ask you something. Did you know who I was talking about last night when I mentioned the Worthingtons?" Agnes removed her gardening gloves and gestured for me to sit on a small bench beside her garden. "I've known Harold and Eleanor for 23 years, she said quietly. "I worked for the family that owns this estate, and the Worthingtons were frequent guests. I saw enough to understand what kind of people they really are." "What do you mean?" "I mean, I've watched them systematically destroy every relationship Richards tried to have with someone they deemed unsuitable." "You're not the first young woman to come crying to me after discovering what that family is capable of." My heart started racing. There have been others, 6 that I know of over the past 15 years. Each time the same pattern. Richard brings home a girl his parents don't approve of, and within weeks, that girl's family starts experiencing problems. Financial troubles, job losses, legal issues. Always something that can be traced back to Harold's connections, but never anything you could prove in court. Agnes stood up and walked to her cottage, returning with a small wooden box. I started keeping records after the 3rd girl came to me in tears begging for help. I've documented everything I could over the years. She opened the box to reveal a collection of newspaper clippings, printed emails, and handwritten notes. Photos of Richard with different women, articles about their family's subsequent troubles, even some recorded conversations when Harold was careless enough to discuss business on his phone near my garden. "You recorded him. The walls between our properties are thin, and Harold has never been as careful as he thinks. When you work invisibly for wealthy people for as long as I have, you learn that they often forget you have ears." Agnes handed me a small digital recorder. "This is from 2 months ago, when Harold was discussing how to handle a potential problem with his son's new girlfriend. I believe that was you." I played the recording with shaking hands. Harold's voice was crystal clear as he discussed hiring a private investigator to dig into my background and find leverage against my family. Eleanor could be heard suggesting specific vulnerabilities to exploit, including my father's business and my student loans. "Why didn't you ever come forward before?" I asked. "With what?" The word of an elderly woman who cleans houses against one of the most powerful families in the state. Harold has judges, police officers, and politicians in his pocket. I tried once after the 2nd girl, and suddenly, I was being investigated for tax evasion, and threatened with deportation despite being a citizen for 40 years. But you kept collecting evidence. I kept hoping that someday someone would be strong enough to fight back. Someone who wouldn't just quietly disappear when threatened. Agnes looked at me intently. I think you might be that person, Martha. Armed with Agnes's evidence and Diane's corroboration, I decided to confront Harold and Eleanor directly. But first, I wanted to give Richard one final chance to see his parents for who they really were. I called him and asked him to meet me at a coffee shop near his office. When I showed him the recordings and explained what I'd discovered, his reaction was exactly what Diane had predicted. This is insane, Martha. You're talking about my parents like they're criminals. They've devoted their lives to charity work and community service. Richard listened to the recording. That's your father's voice planning to destroy my family. It could be anyone's voice. This old woman you're talking about probably has dementia or something. And this Diane person you contacted is obviously bitter about your relationship. I stared at him, seeing clearly for the first time how completely his parents controlled him. Your father is threatening to ruin my dad's business unless I break up with you. How can you not see what's wrong with that? Even if that were true, which I don't believe, maybe they're just trying to protect me. You have to understand, Martha. I've been hurt before by women who were only interested in my money. I've never asked you for anything financial, Richard. I've always insisted on paying my own way. That's exactly what someone trying to appear uninterested in money would do. I realized then that there was no reaching him. His parents had spent years conditioning him to distrust anyone outside their approved circle, to see their manipulations as acts of love and protection. That evening, I drove to the Worthington estate one final time. This time, I wasn't nervous or intimidated. I was angry, and I had evidence. Harold answered the door himself, his surprise quickly masked by his usual cold smile. Martha, how unexpected. Richard isn't here. I'm not here to see Richard. I'm here to talk to you and Eleanor. Of course. Please come in. Eleanor appeared in the foyer, looking perfectly put together, as always. What a pleasant surprise. I was just telling Harold how much we enjoyed meeting you the other night. I'm sure you were. I followed them into the same formal living room where we'd had drinks before dinner. I know what you're doing to my family. Harold's expression didn't change, but I saw Eleanor's smile falter slightly. I'm not sure what you mean, dear. I pulled out my phone and played Agnes's recording. The sound of Harold's voice discussing plans to target my father's business filled the elegant room. The silence that followed was deafening. Eleanor's face had gone pale while Harold simply stared at me with calculating eyes. That recording could have been made by anyone, he said finally. Voice technology these days is quite sophisticated. I also spoke with Diane Chen. She told me exactly how you destroyed her brother's immigration case to force her away from Richard. Eleanor recovered first, her mask slipping back into place. I don't know who's been filling your head with these ridiculous stories, but... And I have documentation of your pattern of behavior with at least 6 other women over the past 15 years. That got Harold's attention. He stood up slowly, his demeanor changing from dismissive to genuinely threatening. Miss Thompson, I think you should be very careful about making accusations you can't prove. Slander can be a very expensive mistake. Is that a threat? It's friendly advice. You seem like a nice girl, but you're clearly in over your head. Why don't you take some time to think about what's really important to you? Your family's security, for instance. Eleanor stood as well, moving to stand beside her husband in a show of unity. Martha, dear, I think you're letting stress cloud your judgment. Perhaps you should focus on your own life instead of listening to gossip from disgruntled former employees and bitter ex-girlfriends. My father received a call about an IRS audit yesterday. Funny timing, don't you think? The IRS audits thousands of small businesses every year, Harold said smoothly. Most of them have irregularities that require correction. Expensive correction. The casual way he said it, the slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth, confirmed everything I'd suspected. He wasn't even bothering to deny it anymore. You can't keep doing this to people, I said, standing to face them both. Someday someone's going to fight back. Eleanor laughed, the sound as cold as winter wind. Oh, my dear naive girl, do you have any idea who you're dealing with? Harold sits on the boards of 3 major companies, has personal relationships with senators and judges, and donates more money to political campaigns in a single year than you'll earn in your entire lifetime. Money doesn't make you untouchable, doesn't it? Harold's smile was predatory now. Your father's business could be shut down with a single phone call. Your student loans could be called in immediately due to technical violations you didn't even know existed. Your teaching license could be revoked based on anonymous complaints about inappropriate conduct. I felt the walls closing in, understanding for the first time the true scope of their power and influence. No wonder so many other women had simply disappeared rather than fight. But we're not unreasonable people, Eleanor continued, her voice taking on a syrupy tone. We understand that young people sometimes need time to make mature decisions. We're prepared to be patient. What do you want? End your relationship with Richard, Harold said simply. Disappear quietly from his life. In return, your family's troubles go away, and you can get on with your life without any further complications. And if I don't, Eleanor's smile was razor sharp, then you'll learn that there are consequences for people who don't know their place. I looked at both of them, these elegant monsters in their beautiful house, and realized that I had to make a choice. I could walk away, protect my family, and let them continue destroying other people's lives. Or I could fight back and risk everything. But then I thought about Agnes, who'd spent years documenting their crimes while living in fear. I thought about Diane and her brother, whose dreams had been shattered by these people's casual cruelty. I thought about all the other women who'd been too intimidated or too isolated to fight back. I'm not going anywhere, I said quietly, and I'm not staying quiet. Harold's expression darkened. That would be a very expensive mistake, Miss Thompson. Maybe, but it would be the right mistake to make. I walked out of that house knowing that I was about to enter a war I might not win, but one I couldn't avoid fighting. The next morning, I started making calls to every contact I'd developed over the years, former students whose parents worked in law enforcement college, friends who'd become journalists, professional connections through my teaching career. My first stop was the local FBI field office, where I presented Agnes's evidence and my own documentation of the Worthingtons' pattern of harassment and intimidation. The agent I spoke with, a woman named Sarah Martinez, listened carefully to my story and examined the recordings with obvious interest. This is compelling evidence, she said, but building a federal case takes time. Meanwhile, they're likely to escalate their pressure on you and your family. She was right. Within days, my father received notice that his business was being audited not just by the IRS, but also by the state revenue department. My mother's insurance company suddenly found reasons to question claims they'd previously approved. I received a letter from my student loan servicer claiming I'd violated terms of my agreement and demanding immediate payment of the full balance. But I wasn't the only one fighting back anymore. Agnes had connected me with 2 other women who'd been targeted by the Worthingtons in recent years. Together, we formed a support network that shared information and resources. Sarah Martinez introduced me to an investigative journalist named Marcus Webb, who'd been looking for a way to expose corruption among the city's elite families. When I showed him our evidence, his eyes lit up with the fire of someone who'd finally found the story he'd been waiting for. This is bigger than just one family, he explained during our first meeting. The Worthingtons are part of a network of wealthy families who've been using their influence to manipulate the system for decades. Your story could be the key to exposing all of them. Marcus began his own investigation, using his media connections to dig deeper into Harold's business dealings and political relationships. What he found was a web of corruption that extended far beyond intimidating his son's girlfriends. Harold had been using his influence to secure city contracts for his friends' companies, manipulate zoning decisions to benefit his real estate investments, and even influence judicial appointments to ensure favorable treatment in legal matters. Meanwhile, I continued teaching while dealing with the constant stress of the Worthingtons' retaliation. My principal, Dr. Roberts, called me into her office after receiving what she described as anonymous complaints about my teaching methods. "Martha, I've known you for 5 years, and these complaints don't match anything I've observed about your work," she said, sliding a folder across her desk. "But the district is requiring me to conduct a formal investigation." I opened the folder to find printed emails alleging that I'd been showing inappropriate favoritism to certain students using class time to discuss my personal life, and even suggestions that I'd been drinking during school hours. "Dr. Roberts, none of this is true, and you know it." "I absolutely know it. But the complaints came through official channels, and some of them claim to have photo evidence. I have to follow protocol." Looking at the accusations, I could see Harold's hand behind them. They were exactly the kind of vague but serious-sounding allegations that would be difficult to disprove and would cast doubt on my character, even if I was ultimately cleared. That evening, I called Agnes to update her on the latest developments. Her voice was grim but determined. "They're pulling out all the stops now," she said. "That means they're scared. Harold doesn't usually escalate this quickly unless he feels cornered." "I'm starting to wonder if I can really win this." "You're not fighting alone anymore, dear. That makes all the difference." She was right. Over the following weeks, Marcus's investigation began to bear fruit. His articles, published in the city's alternative weekly newspaper, started attracting attention from larger media outlets. The FBI investigation that Sarah Martinez had initiated began uncovering financial irregularities in Harold's business dealings. Most importantly, other victims started coming forward. Women who'd been too afraid or too ashamed to speak up before found the courage to share their stories when they realized they weren't alone. The breaking point came when Marcus published a comprehensive exposé titled "The Worthington Way: How One Family Built an Empire on Fear and Intimidation." The article detailed not just the family's treatment of Richard's girlfriends, but their broader pattern of using wealth and influence to destroy anyone who opposed them. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The newspaper's website crashed from traffic. Social media exploded with support for the victims, and other journalists began investigating similar families in the area. Harold tried to control the narrative using his media connections to discredit the story and threaten lawsuits. But the evidence was too compelling, and the public response too strong. The final confrontation came when Richard appeared at my apartment 3 weeks after the story broke. He looked haggard and confused, like someone who'd just woken up from a long dream. "Is it true?" he asked without preamble. "All of it." "You tell me, Richard. You've known your parents your whole life." He slumped into a chair, putting his head in his hands. "I thought they were protecting me. I thought the women who left were just, I don't know, using me." "They were protecting their control over you. There's a difference." "Diane called me yesterday. She told me about her brother, about what my father did to him." Richard looked up at me with tears in his eyes. "Martha, I'm so sorry. I should have believed you." "What are you going to do now?" "I've already done it. I gave the FBI everything I could find in my father's home office. Bank records, correspondence, recorded phone calls he thought were private, and I'm prepared to testify against them if necessary. Richard's cooperation provided the final pieces of evidence the FBI needed. Harold was arrested 2 weeks later on charges of conspiracy, racketeering, and corruption. Eleanor was charged as an accessory for her role in coordinating many of the harassment campaigns. The legal proceedings took months, but eventually both Harold and Eleanor were convicted and sentenced to federal prison. Their assets were seized, their business empire dismantled, and their reputation destroyed. Richard entered therapy to work through years of psychological manipulation and control. We tried to rebuild our relationship, but too much damage had been done. The man I'd fallen in love with had been shaped by toxic influences, and even though he was working to change, we both knew we needed to heal separately. 2 years later, I was teaching a new group of students when I received a phone call that brought everything full circle. It was from a young woman named Lisa who'd found my contact information through one of Marcus's articles. "Ms. Thompson, I think I need your help," she said, her voice shaking. "I've been dating someone whose family is treating me the same way the Worthingtons treated you." I arranged to meet Lisa at a coffee shop, bringing Agnes along for her wisdom and experience. As we listened to Lisa's story, I realized that our victory against the Worthingtons had inspired other victims to speak up, but it had also shown other wealthy families that they needed to be more careful about their methods. That meeting led to the formation of what we called the Truth Network, a support group and advocacy organization for people being targeted by wealthy families who used their power to manipulate and control. Agnes became our unofficial historian, documenting cases and patterns. I used my teaching skills to help victims understand their rights and options. Marcus continued investigating similar families, exposing corruption and abuse of power wherever he found it. The FBI agent Sarah Martinez left federal service to start a private investigation firm specializing in cases involving wealthy individuals who thought they were above the law. My father's business not only survived the audit but thrived afterward as the community rallied around our family in support. My mother's health improved once the stress of the insurance battles ended. I paid off my student loans early, using money from a book deal about my experience. Most importantly, I learned to trust my instincts and stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult or dangerous. The scared young woman who'd driven to that mansion 2 years earlier had been replaced by someone who understood that sometimes the most important battles are the ones that seem impossible to win. Agnes passed away peacefully last spring, but not before seeing the network she'd helped create expand to include hundreds of families across the country who'd been targeted by wealthy predators. Her cottage is now a resource center for victims, and her garden has become a memorial to all the people who suffered in silence before finding the courage to speak up. I never married Richard, but I did find love again with someone who valued my strength and integrity from the very beginning. David is a civil rights lawyer who works with our network to provide legal support for victims. He proposed not in some fancy restaurant, but in Agnes's garden, saying he wanted to ask me to marry him in the place where I'd learned to fight for what matters. The most rewarding part of my new life is working with young women who find themselves in situations similar to what I experienced. I tell them what Agnes told me that first night: trust your instincts, stand up for others, and remember that sometimes the people who rescue strangers are the ones who most need rescuing themselves. Looking back, I realized that stopping to help Agnes wasn't just an act of kindness, it was the moment my real life began. If I hadn't pulled over that night, I would have married into a family of monsters, spent years having my spirit slowly crushed, and never discovered what I was truly capable of. The Worthington mansion sits empty now, a monument to the truth that money and power built on cruelty and fear will eventually crumble. But Agnes's little cottage behind it thrives, filled with people working to ensure that what happened to so many women before me never happens again. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you had to choose between staying safe and doing what's right? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please give it a like and subscribe for more real-life stories about standing up to powerful people who think they're untouchable. And please share this with anyone who might need to know that they're not alone in their fight against intimidation and abuse. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that no matter how powerful someone seems, the truth has a way of coming to light when people have the courage to speak it. You're stronger than you know, and you deserve relationships built on love and respect, not fear and control. Stay strong, trust your instincts, and never let anyone convince you that you're not worth fighting for.